Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on when you may be watching this. I am Jamie Moeller, and this is the Grad Connection, where my goal is to try to help graduate students as they navigate through graduate education, and I want to see them thrive as they do so. This week, I really struggled with a topic that I wanted to talk about along the teaching assistant series. I think this is number 7 or 8. I can't remember. The number will actually be in there, I suppose, when I put it online here. But when I looked at the topics that I had written out or drawn out that I was going to kind of talk about, this was not one that was, this topic was not part of it. And I looked at the list and nothing jumped out at me, nothing kind of resonated. And on my drive in, something popped into my mind that I think a lot of people struggle with. And I don't care whether you're a beginning graduate student starting teaching, or you're starting your research, or maybe you're an assistant professor or someone who's beginning their teaching at a university or somewhere. Maybe you're even a seasoned individual, because I think seasoned individuals can struggle with this just as much at times as folks that are newcomers. And the topic that I want to talk about today is something called imposter syndrome. Now, I will tell you that I am not an expert in imposter syndrome, but I've been around the topic enough that I think I can talk about it, and certainly can reference several things online that I think that you should kind of take a look at if this is something that you are dealing with. So first of all, what is imposter syndrome? So first of all, probably the best definition, and a kind of a modern definition, and this comes from a Harvard Business Review article that I'll put in the show notes. There's 3 articles that I think I'm going to point you to in the notes, and I'd encourage you to read them. But the way they describe it is doubting your abilities or feeling like a fraud. That's one definition. Another site that I come across, more of a kind of a psychology approach, is basically feeling like you're not as competent as others perceive you to be. And there are several different kind of, what I want to say, signs of this. First of all, just self-doubt. But also not really having a perception of being able to really assess your strengths and weaknesses. Thinking that your success or the things that you're good at is the result of some external factor or some other kind of context, not necessarily you. Being hard on yourself, kind of berating your performance, as it were. Having a kind of this gnawing fear that you're not going to live up to expectations. Being an overachiever and basically being a perfectionist. Doing things that sabotage your own success, whether you're aware of it or not. And then basically setting goals and then feeling disappointed when you aren't able to get to them, because you've just set goals that are kind of unrealistic or too far beyond your ability and such. So all of these things kind of describe what I'm talking about as it relates to imposter syndrome. Now, it's not a new concept, right? The origin of this was basically in the 1970s. I think it was 1978 to be exact, but don't quote me on that, I suppose. But it was labeled the imposter phenomenon, and it was by 2 researchers, Imes and Clance. And kind of the ways they described it, they said, you're unable to internalize or accept your success. You attribute it to luck rather than ability. And they also, one of the other things that I think that was important to note is, at least in the initial or original articles, they said that they noted that anxiety and depression oftentimes go hand in hand with what they had labeled as imposter phenomenon. Now, fast forward, and a lot of the materials since the 90s have focused and really attributed this to be a unique characteristic that's associated with women in various professions. And so there's a lot of discussion when you talk about diversity materials, inclusion materials, those kinds of things. There's a lot of association of imposter syndrome being very typical with women. And so it's often attributed to as a commonality in women. But one of the things that a more modern article from the Harvard Business Review, which I'm going to link, basically the article's titled "Stop Telling Women That They Have Imposter Syndrome." One of the things they note is that imposter syndrome, or at least the discussion of it and being uniquely attributed to women necessarily, it ignores all the other kinds of biases that may exist. And the fact that, one of the things I would argue is I don't know that it's particularly unique to women. I think it's something that anyone can experience. Because I think at various levels, every person that's basically not a narcissist and has the dark tetrad of characteristics probably struggles with at some point. And I think this is a very common thing. So, how does this apply to teaching? Well, I think this is kind of where the thought came from when I was driving was, when you need to present to people, maybe even in like an interview situation. Oftentimes it can, the thoughts creep up of what if I make a mistake? What if I don't have the words? What if I look nervous? It's all of the what ifs that run through your mind when you're getting ready to do something that really challenges or pushes you, at least in my opinion. Another thing in teaching, sometimes I think a lot of teachers struggle with, particularly I'll say when I was a graduate student teacher, one of the things I always worried about was, what if somebody asked me a question that I can't answer? I'm supposed to be this expert. And what if they ask me a question that I can't answer? What if I don't know the answer? And so, while I'm on this topic, one of the things you do as a teacher, I think, is you start to learn some responses, right? Sometimes you'll be thrown into a class and you don't have time to prepare, and you're kind of maybe only 1 week ahead, 1 week ahead of the students. And so this can be, this feeling of him being an imposter can very much and be something that we struggle with. And so you can develop responses. And honestly, one of the things that I started to do, I don't fear telling people, well, I don't have the answer to that, but I'll get back with you on it, right? Or this is something that I have not dealt with, so let me do some homework on it and get back with you. And that seems to be a very respectable answer, and it has gotten, at least for me, it's gotten rid of that concern that if I don't have an answer to a question, it just doesn't bother me anymore. Another thing last week, I was talking about active learning techniques. And so certainly imposter syndrome can be a challenge if you're wanting to experiment with active learning techniques, because, the question is, what if I fail? What if I get up there and nobody says anything? What if the conversation gets over in left field and I don't know how to redirect it and get it back? What if I end up with a heckler in my class in a worst case scenario? So this list of what ifs can go on forever. All I want to do is acknowledge that I think that every person, again, assuming that they have some sense of humility, for a lack of a better term, probably struggles with this to a certain degree. And so I think this can happen anywhere. I'm talking about it in terms of teaching. But I think, I know for myself when I've done interviews, like when I've been interviewing for positions, certainly I have felt this. I have self-doubts and those kinds of things. And I guess, first thing is, I want to talk about how can we counteract that, and then what are some strategies. So I want to first note that feeling unsure or uncertain about yourself does not make you an imposter. It makes you human. Now, and I would also acknowledge the degree to which you might struggle with that has a lot to do with, I think, your experiences growing up, how, whether comments were made to you as a child of, either encouraging statements were made to you or discouraging statements were made to you. I think that's something that sets a framework in the mind environmentally for people that you can struggle with for years and years and years. Same thing is true with bias and discrimination. I think the more bias and discrimination you have experienced as an individual, the greater you're going to struggle with imposter syndrome. It's just, I think that's a reality. Now, and I think that's why for quite a long time, professional materials about advancing women in whatever careers, a lot of times that material focused on and acknowledged imposter syndrome, because obviously folks have experienced discrimination and bias there. But I don't think, I guess I would say, I think everybody struggles with to a certain degree. But when it becomes a crippling thing, that's certainly something. So first of all, just feeling unsure and uncertain does not make you an imposter. It simply makes you human. That's number one. Number two, I would encourage you to try to get at the root of your uncertainty if you can. Now, that's a really hard thing to do. But as you get older, hopefully you learn more about yourself. Hopefully you have a curiosity about yourself and why you think the way you do, where, if you have biases, where they come from, if you have strengths, where they come from. Hopefully you have that curiosity to learn about yourself and to understand. Bias and discrimination is something that oftentimes is in your past and in your experiences. And at least understanding the root of some of those things, I think can help us deal with it better. It may not quote unquote fix. That's not really the right word, but nevertheless, I think having an idea of where things are rooted and where they come from, some of the behaviors, some of your thought patterns, some of those kinds of things, I think that can be helpful and useful. And then the other thing, and this is just my experience. This is not something that I've found in the literature. I have not had time to dig into this extremely deeply. Again, I wasn't planning on doing a talk or doing a video on this topic. It just seemed that's what my heart said that I needed to talk about today. And so the other thing I would say is I think introversion magnifies the feelings of imposter syndrome. And I think a lot of people that work in a university environment are introverts. Extroverts, and what I mean by an introvert is someone who basically generates energy inside themselves, as opposed to an extrovert who gets energy from other people. Again, I've probably said this in other videos, the easy way to tell whether you're an extrovert or an introvert is after a long day, what do you want to do? Do you want to go home and be by yourself, or do you want to go out and be in a party, right? And if you want to go home and be by yourself, you're an introvert, or at least you have introvert tendencies. And so I would say that I think introverts struggle with this more because I think the thought patterns and stuff, introverts are in their head more. And they don't have any other, a lot of times it's like extroverts, it's not to say that they're not in their head, but oftentimes they're interacting with other people, and so they're bouncing ideas off of other people, and their thoughts are malleable, and they basically morph as they talk with other people. I mean, they talk things out loud, as opposed to an introvert who generally only takes in information and there's no assessment except for the individual's assessment of their own thoughts. And so if you're hard on yourself, if you're critical of yourself, if you doubt yourself, if you have these things, all it does is churn inside the mind of the introvert. I can't talk as an extrovert because I'm not one, right? So maybe somebody else can rebut this if this is the same kind of thing that an extrovert goes through, but I'll certainly say as a capital I introvert, I certainly deal with this. So I'll give you some strategies, and in the articles that I'm going to link, there are also strategies, and these are kind of derivations of some of the articles. So these are just my takes on stuff that I've read and stuff, right? First of all, I think you have to recognize your own expertise and your own limits and just be real. And again, just be real with yourself, and not try to hide. Be comfortable in your own skin. I don't know what other words I want to use there, but recognize your own expertise and its limits. And when you do something well, recognize that. Don't ditz yourself. Don't degrade yourself, because all that does is feed the self-doubt. Second, focus on what you do well. That is your strengths. And there are lots of different materials out there. My general philosophy is I think it makes a whole lot more sense for you to focus on your strengths than it does to try to counter your weaknesses. The efforts that you would spend in building your strengths are probably going to be more impactful and more rewarding if you focus on strengths rather than weaknesses. And there is literature out there. Now, I will say there's probably literature on both sides of this who would argue both ways. But nevertheless, focus on what you do well and recognize that. Be comfortable with that. Don't, when somebody comes up and says to you that you've done something well, don't dismiss it. Accept it. Accept it as at face value, and that they're well-meaning and that they're trying to encourage you. Third, no one is perfect. We're all learning. We're all improving. We're all growing. We're all expanding, and we're all trying to suck less. And we're all at different points in our journey. And so I think we have to give ourselves, and I'm speaking to myself as much as I would be speaking to anybody else, but I think we need to give ourselves more grace and more room to grow and more acceptance and that kind of thing. And second, we need to do that with other people. And I firmly believe you'll never do that with other people if you don't start with yourself. And there's lots of information out there that backs up that idea of simply, first and foremost, you need to start with yourself and just give yourself some grace and realize that you're not going to be perfect. You can strive for that, but there's something, I think it can be unhealthy. And I think I have in my past, and maybe even in my present, I kind of have a little bit of an unhealthy mentality towards that because I'm a perfectionist. Now, as I'm getting older, I'm learning more and more how to be less of a perfectionist, but I'm still learning, right? There are still times that I'm hard on myself. And one of the things that I think that is true is oftentimes if you find someone who is hard on others, they've been hard on themselves first. And so it really does take some measure of giving yourself grace and room to grow, room to make mistakes and learn from those mistakes. And then lastly, number 4 would be confide in a mentor. Hopefully you can create, I've got a video out there about creating a mentoring team. Hopefully you've got some people that you can talk to who've walked the road that you've walked and who can help encourage you and point out when you're being unnecessarily hard on yourself. When you're not giving yourself credit, when you're trying to, excuse away success for whatever reason. Another thing that can help is an executive coach. If you have an executive coach or have the opportunity to work with an executive coach, do it. Now, first you have to find an executive coach that kind of, fits with you. But I would encourage you, you can learn a lot. I've worked with an executive coach for about a period of 4 years. I worked with an executive coach, and I've started that up again because I found a lot of value in being able to, the executive coach I work with, a lot of times she can see things that I can't see. She can point my attention to things that I might miss, positive and negative. But long story short is having someone else close to you that can speak into your life, that you can bounce off ideas off of, and that can encourage you and try to help remove or at least lessen some of that self-doubt that exists. So I know this is kind of a strange topic to bring, but this is what was on my heart and mind to bring today as I wrestled with what I was going to talk about. So hopefully you found this useful. I know more and more of you there are more and more people that are subscribing on YouTube and on the private Facebook group. And if you're new there, let me say on either of those, let me say welcome. I hope you find this content useful. I guess my mindset is, if this is helping a few people, then that's really, if it's helping people, and that's really been my heart all along, and being in higher ed is just to help people to grow, to expand, and to suck less. So with that, let me say have a great weekend. I hope that you find this content useful. Bye-bye.